Hey, what's up guys? Off-brand Pizzle here. Today we're going to chronicleize the story of Freddy vs. Jason. Now this is going to be taking place in a number of parts. We'll be referencing things from the book Slash of the Titans, written by the great Dustin McNeil. Dustin McNeil was also the author of Taking Shape, and we know how great that book was based on these videos I was doing and the book itself, which I still can't recommend enough. There are so much details in there. Now with this book, we're going to be referencing things throughout it, but obviously I'm not giving away every bit of information because I want you guys to get that book. So far it's really good. This is going to be part one of the story of Freddy vs. Jason, a tale that is crazy in and of itself. And we're going to start today at the roots of things, so here we go. Now there's a lot of ways you could start the story of Freddy vs. Jason. You could talk about when the first time maybe somebody had the idea to put them together, or the studios might have started getting notions that the fans would want something like this. But frankly, we're going to start things from a business point of view. We're going to start with 1989, which would see a decline for both in their own right. Despite having astronomical box office success with The Dream Master, looking back, I think it's clear to see that maybe there was a little too much Freddy for the public at that time. For starters, The Dream Child was rushed into production and came out less than a year before the previous film, all while having Freddy's nightmares come on TV on a weekly basis. Freddy was everywhere, and The Dream Master would document the heights of the series in the 1980s. Despite Friday Part 5 scaring away a lot of fans, Part 6 rejuvenated that series and got fans back into the theater, with Part 7 holding strong in its box office rights all of its own. Despite the fact that it wasn't having the success of like the first 3 or 4 Fridays had, the money was still pouring in and staying consistent. But it wouldn't be until Jason Takes Manhattan that we would push the budget for this series, all while having the film not be as successful. So 1989, while I think it's a cool year, it's clear that there was a bit of decline and studios wondering what's next with these characters. The absolute most crucial part of the story is New Line and Sean Cunningham. Sean Cunningham saw that Friday the 13th was starting to wane with the company Paramount and was able to strike a deal that was unlike anything in movie history at the time. Sean could get the rights to the character of Jason, but not the title Friday the 13th. In essence, Sean was able to strike a deal, get the rights to Jason, sell it to New Line. New Line could now produce a movie with characters from the series, but not the Friday the 13th name. That would retain at Paramount. So what a weird thing. And I can't think of any kind of movie deal that's ever been like that ever. One thing that is crucial with Sean Cunningham getting the rights to Jason Voorhees is the fact that Frank Mancuso Jr., the legendary producer for almost all the Friday the 13th films, who basically was the flag bearer for the series for many years, left working on the Friday the 13th projects, giving no champion for the series anymore after 1989. Without Frank Mancuso in the picture, it's easy to see how Sean could strike a deal with the character of Jason from Paramount. But with Frank Mancuso, had he not waned and wanted to get away, that might not have happened. You would think now that Sean got the rights to Jason and brought it to New Line that the movie would happen right then and there. But one thing I thought that was interesting that the book talked about, and it makes sense, the importance of Freddy's dead. Now that may sound a little bit weird, but hear me out. With Dream Child having a dip in box office, New Line figured, well, I guess this thing has run its course, so we may as well end things on a bang. The promotion for Freddy's Dead seemed to be so good that people came to the theater in droves. The success of Freddy's Dead made New Line think that, hey, maybe we don't have to do this battle just yet. We can continue this series with these characters separately and not spend a fortune on scripts and production and work our way to Freddy vs. Jason down the road. This is another reason why a movie called Jason Goes to Hell would come out. Freddy's Dead just made a good bit of money. Why not just make a Jason movie for now? Because one thing that was noted that was seen throughout this book was that New Line truly did not want to just make the film and just shove it out there. They were actually trying to make the best crossover monster movie they could make, because this wasn't a new thing. We would see this happen with the Universal monsters back in the day, and a lot of those movies were received poorly. New Line wanted to make this film really good, and even though we could look at it in hindsight and think that's not true, it took a decade to make, so I can kind of see that side of it. So post Jason Goes to Hell and then even New Nightmare, New Line started to get things going. But there was one important thing for this to happen. Sean Cunningham and producer Mike DeLuca had to approve any script that would get sent to New Line. They would be the driving forces on stories and ideas and the way we got to Freddy vs. Jason. So Mike DeLuca is extremely important to the story, as well as Sean Cunningham, but most Friday the 13th fans already know that. So during the 90s, the internet was starting to become a thing, and during this time there would be a lot of BS bogus articles because anybody could put information on the internet. We know that to be true now. Hell, you're watching a video right now of some guy putting out this information about this movie. But the infancy of the internet at that time would be ripe with misinformation and untruths. One article saw Chucky joining in on the fight and Blade director Stephen Norrington being attached to the project, while to this day he touts his uninvolvement. His Wikipedia page up until a certain time was still claiming that he was involved. So there was a lot of crazy stuff on the internet. I can understand probably in the 90s the concept of just misinformation being on the internet was probably a weird thing, because typically, you know, when you got books from school, when you think about books, they came from school, so it was ripe with information. You would kind of think the internet would be the same way, but boy, oh boy, has that proved to not be true. So now that we're in the mid-90s, New Line has came out with Jason Goes to Hell, which had a respectable box office but horrible reviews, a New Nightmare, which had really good reviews but not a great box office. The time was right. These characters had gone as far as they could, and it was time to produce the seminal Freddy vs. Jason movie that all the fans wanted. And there would be some familiar faces that would almost get involved with the project. One name would be Tom McLaughlin, the director of Friday the 13th Part 6. Friday 6 director Tom McLaughlin recalls meeting with New Line in the 90s for a film that would have seen two mental patients who strongly identified as both Freddy and Jason, and would essentially in the film become those characters in some sort of meta way. New Line would quickly show him the door. Tom was also interviewed in the book, and he talked about just thinking that they needed to truly do something innovative and different. I can appreciate that take from Tom, but in the 90s, I don't think audiences really would have been ready for that. Hell, look at New Nightmare. The box office really wasn't that good for it. Whether it be that people might have thought this was some different Freddy and not the Freddy that they knew and loved, or sheer burnout, the fact of the matter is, people didn't go to see that movie. So Tom having that idea, I can understand why New Line was probably like, this isn't the way to go. Now, for the end of this episode, we're going to talk about two of the initial treatments and drafts that Sean and Mike DeLuca would approve and New Line would purchase, but ultimately not use at all. And some of them are very wild. So let's get into two of the earliest drafts for Freddy vs. Jason. Louis Abernathy was one of the initial screenwriters to pen a treatment with Nightmare 13, Freddy Meets Jason. And despite little to no directing experience, his friend James Cameron actually went to bat for him at New Line, but New Line quickly objected to that. Now, his treatment would see a group of Freddy fanatic cult members impregnating a virgin bride to resurrect their idol Freddy. An ex-cult member whom was incarcerated would recommend Jason be resurrected as well to stop the evil Freddy from continuing his reign of terror. Despite the initial treatment being exiled from New Line, it would serve as a blueprint for some story elements. Some years after passing in the script, New Line would reconsider and have David J. Shaw do some rewrites on Nightmare 13. Eventually, rewrites went nowhere and the script died. Now, this is just something I picked up on a personal note. It seems like in a lot of these drafts, there seems to be somewhat of a common thread, and that is making Jason the good guy between the two. I guess I can naturally see that in a way, because when you look at the roots of the characters, Freddy is far more sinister and evil as opposed to Jason, who was kind of given bad luck in life. And those story elements are pretty wild. I don't know if they would have worked in the movie, and I'm just not sure if the audience would accept that for a movie that's called Freddy vs. Jason. I'd like to think they'd want to keep it simple, but sometimes thinking about it and picturing those movies in my head, they could be really cool. But ultimately, that was a script that was purchased and then thrown to the side. Now let's talk about one more early draft for Freddy vs. Jason. The Brandon Braga and Ronald D. Moore draft, Jason vs. Freddy, lived in a world where the Elm Street films were real, but the Friday the 13th films were films, yet based on a real-life Jason Voorhees. This film saw the real-life Jason kill two realtors who were scouting the Crystal Lake area for redevelopment. So if this sounds kind of weird, basically the Elm Street films exist in this world, but the Friday the 13th films are films in the Elm Street world, but they're based on an actual Jason. So Jason is like this Ted Bundy if Ted Bundy had got this slasher franchise based off of him. And so these two realtors go to Crystal Lake to try to redevelop this area that was now doomed because of the supposed killer Jason, and the actual Jason showed up and killed those two realtors. Pretty weird, but that's what it is. This Jason was supposed to resemble a Part 2 or 3 look. More human, but still scarred and brutal than the average man, and still a strong, burly force. After getting captured and tried in court, a shootout happens during the trial, putting the real-life Jason in the hospital and on heavy sleeping medicine, where Freddy invades his dreams and uses him to invade reality. The writers claim they drew influence from the O.J. Simpson trial since it was happening in real time while writing their script. Despite DeLuca and Cunningham working closely on story ideas with these two writers, New Line would eventually exile the script. The interesting thing is that they were buying these scripts. So when we talk about how expensive Freddy vs. Jason was, you gotta think about how many hundreds of thousands of dollars were poured into buying scripts. And that is a really wild, interesting way to look at the film, where Jason movies are Jason movies in the movie, but there's a real-life Jason Voorhees, and the Freddy films are real. It's really confusing, but I don't know. That's a film I could not judge at all unless I saw it. So guys, this is part 1 of the story of Freddy vs. Jason. We're going to chronicleize a lot of the scripts that would be famous throughout these years that would ultimately get trashed and put to the side, along with the making of the film Freddy vs. Jason towards the end. If you think this is going to be a fun series, please give me a thumbs up and drop your comments below on those early drafts of Freddy vs. Jason we just mentioned. Give me your thoughts on 1989 for the slashers and the way the early 90s were looking with Jason Goes to Hell and New Nightmare and Freddy's Dead. Do you think that this movie should have been made in the 90s? Or do you think it came out at the right time? Or do you think there may not have ever been a truly right time for a movie like this? Or does it come down to the script? We're going to talk more about scripts and the story to Freddy vs. Jason very soon, but thanks for watching part 1. Thank you to all my supporters on Patreon. To get behind the scenes photos, videos, and music, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month.